Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it.
Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are reacting to or discussing The Thin Red Line, which came out in 1998, which seems like a long time ago, and it is. It was written and directed by Terrence Malick, who apparently is a big deal, and it's based on a novel of the same name by James Jones, which came out in 1962, and Sam has read it. This is the second adaptation of the book The Thin Red Line, because the first one was made in 1964 and was directed by Andrew Martin, which Sam has seen and I have not. It's the tale of a company of American soldiers fighting on Guadalcanal in late 1942 and early 1943. Though it's not exactly a memoir, Jones fought at the Battle of Mount Aston, the Galloping Horse and the Seahorse on Guadalcanal, so his experiences are interwoven throughout the story. This movie was nominated for several Academy Awards and lost all of them. They didn't win any. The title has two sources. From the Midwestern saying, "There's only a thin line between the sane and the mad," and from Rudyard Kipling's poem Tommy, from the collection Barrack Room Ballads, in which Kipling makes reference to the ways people perceive the differences in soldier in times of war versus peacetime. Then it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and Tommy how's your soul? But it's Thin Red Line of Heroes when the drums begin to roll.
And Barrack Room Ballads, if you recall, was the book that Eugene Sledge gave to Sidney Phillips at the beginning of the Pacific. And it's the book that Sid gives away when he becomes disillusioned and disenchanted with the war. So I thought that was interesting. Little callback there.
Go listen to our Pacific episodes if you want to learn more about that. I feel like this poem has to be in a poem book that I have that's a collection of poems about war. I haven't looked it up, to be honest, but I'm pretty sure it's gonna be in there.
Yeah, it's a famous one.
Yeah. So sorry for butchering it. I'm sure there's supposed to be like an accent in there as well, which I did not do.
What did you think of this movie?
I love this movie. I was really surprised by it, actually. I don't know why I was surprised, but I really enjoyed this movie. I feel like I've seen it before, but not maybe in its entirety. I have, of course, seen Kirk Esposito's death scene a couple times, but it's a beautiful movie. It's beautifully shot. The music is beautiful. The acting is pretty decent. It's a bit of a cameo galore, which I didn't enjoy that much. But overall, it's a different take on a war movie, for sure. It feels really anti-war to me. And we see Guadalcanal anyway. We don't see it anywhere else, it's kind of a heaven on earth kind of place. It's very beautiful, and we see a lot of the nature, and we see a lot of the natives who live there, who live this kind of peaceful life, and then all of it's disturbed by the war. Like, the war's the big evil in this, not even specifically the Japanese, I think. Just the war as a thing is the evil. And that must have stemmed from the book as well. And I really enjoyed it. I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed it because it's long. It's almost 3 hours long, but it's good. How about you?
Yeah, this is a great film. Terrence Malick, before he ever worked in Hollywood, was a philosophy professor, and I think you can tell he has lots of thoughts about human nature and the role of war and this like man versus nature connection and all this kind of stuff. It's funny because he's not a big fan of like dialogue. And apparently, if he has a script, he just cuts dialogue and cuts it and cuts it and cuts it and cuts it. And so he ended up putting in all of these voiceovers from the different characters, kind of ruminating over the situation that they're in and their lives and that kind of stuff. And I think it really works because the book is truly an ensemble piece where you're constantly getting this rotating series of perspectives from all these different guys. And, one of the major themes is how isolating of an experience that war is. And all of these men feel strongly disconnected from the men around them. And they think that their thoughts are deep and dark and unique and not something that you can share with other people because they won't understand. And so I liked that this feels like spiritually probably the strongest adaptation of this book that you could maybe make. I think it would be really tough to do a straight adaptation. But yeah, beautiful cinematography. It got absolutely robbed at the Academy Awards when it lost out on that one. And it was interesting, I thought, that you pointed out the cameos because when the script was first written, the main characters were supposed to be the Adrian Brody character, John C. Reilly character. Like there's a few people. I think Adrian Brody speaks like twice in the movie because the movie got quite reworked before it ended up being released. So actually at the time, all of the quote unquote main characters when they were cast were unknowns. Like no one had ever seen Adrian Brody in anything really. So and this was kind of a deal that Terrence Malick had struck with the studio, I guess, because the studio was like, look, if we're gonna pour all this money into your weird conceptual artsy war movie, then you have to cast some famous people. And so he was like, okay, but I'm not casting famous people in any of the main roles. So all the secondary roles are where you get your like Nick Nolte and your John Travolta and your John Cusack, etc. So yeah,
Yeah.
so also some great acting in here, in case you couldn't tell.
I also wanna, like, point out that this movie almost did not get made. They had to go shopping with other studios because they were like, "It's costing us too much money and you're taking too long, so we're just gonna not make it anymore," and then they had to go shop for another studio. Also, I think the first cut of this movie was 5 hours long. It should give you an idea of how long it took to make this movie. I think it took over 10 years to make in total, which is a long time.
Yeah, and this came on the end of a 20-year break in Terrence Malick making movies. I think during that time he was doing a lot of writing, but he wasn't actually doing any directing or anything like that. So a lot of people wanted to work with him because he had this cachet from having made Badlands and Days of Heaven, I think was the other one. But he was he's apparently a little difficult to work with.
Yeah, and I'm kinda sad because Hans Zimmer, who composed the music for this, lost out on the Academy Award for it. But the one that won was Life is Beautiful, which is also a war movie. So I guess you were into war movies that year.
And I do think we talked about the score to Life is Beautiful when we did our episode on it, so, it must have been good.
It must have been if it won out to this masterpiece. Like, and also if you want to hear something funny, go listen to the main theme of this movie, and then go listen to one of the main themes of Pearl Harbor called Tennessee, also composed by Hans Zimmer. And see if you can notice a similarity there. Spoiler alert, it's the same.
Yeah, he's done a lot of war movies at this point, but he's so good at it, so
He's fantastic. It makes you feel things, his music.
definitely. Apparently, he did fight for his life when he was scoring this movie. He had lived with Terrence Malick for like a year before this movie was made, and apparently they drove each other completely up the wall. Hans Zimmer composed like 6 hours of music for this movie, which is a ton. It's so time consuming. And then there are chunks of the movie that's not even his score. Like there's Melanesian chanting and that kind of stuff. So, so it's just like he put so much work into this, and it just reached a point where, yeah, they were apparently at odds quite a lot of the time.
I did enjoy the Melanesian chanting quite a bit, and I will say that the portrayal of the locals, it didn't feel as caricature as we often see it. It felt to me, but I'm not from there, so I can't tell, but it felt kind of respectful to me, which I enjoyed.
The only thing that's tough is in this whole thing where he's comparing the horror of man and like this like man-made war and that kind of stuff. He kind of places the Melanesian indigenous people on the side of like nature. So it's this kind of like noble savage vibe almost where it's like, yeah, these people live in an untouched society where everything is perfect and they're one with the trees and the animals or whatever. So like a little bit that vibe, but like I agree, it could have been worse.
I'm really glad that this is not another movie where they are portrayed as slaves to the Americans, which we've seen happen before, like if they come upon a indigenous tribe and they become this really weirdly, I don't even know what to call it, like weirdly mystical kind of strange thing in the movie, and at least here it felt kind of natural in a way. I don't know what I'm trying to put across here, but at least I liked it. But like I said, I'm super white and I'm not from there, so maybe I'm totally off base.
Well, I will say I also read the book, so I'll probably talk about that briefly.
Yeah, please.
As you know, probably the first maybe like 40% of it, I wasn't a huge fan. I found it a little bit ponderous, a little bit of a slog. And I guess my initial impression was, yeah, a lot of dads are into this book because it's the peek behind the curtain of the so-called greatest generation. And you get to see these men in the thick of it doing masculine shit or whatever. And I just, my initial thought was like, yeah, not really targeted at me demographic wise. And then as I read on, I started to kind of dig into the themes and I came around in the back third of it or so. And the characters are really varied and well developed and complex, and they're all quite different from one another. And they all have different philosophies on life, and they're all really fleshed out nicely. And I sort of came around to the idea of like, yeah, I am getting a peek behind the curtain, but more in the sense of the psychology of the men involved and the cost of victory, the way these different men suffered in different ways and reacted in different ways. And yeah, you end up with a lot of empathy for them.
I can see that. I can also see why it would be very heavy, and I don't know how much of the voiceover in the movie comes from the book, but if it's a lot like that, it feels like a heavy book to read.
I do think the movie is a little bit more abstractly philosophical than the book. A lot of the characters in the book, their philosophies are a lot more grounded in their lived experiences and that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that. It did feel to me. I struggled a little bit even with the language. I mean, I know English pretty well, as we all know, but some of it I was like, wait, what does this word mean? It feels really like vague, which I think for me made it difficult to listen to. So I wasn't paying attention as much to the dialogue as I was to the nature in it. But I don't think it matters specifically that much.
So apparently none of this voiceover was in the script. And one of Terrence Malick's whole things is that he's not a big fan of storyboarding. He just kind of wants to chase wherever the themes take him. And so some of the dialogue was based on real conversations that Sean Penn and Jim Caviezel were having, out of character. And some of the voiceovers were put in at the end to kind of steer it more in the way that Terrence Malick later decided that he wanted the movie to go.
Mm.
And so I do think potentially when you do that, there is a lot of opportunity for maybe it to be a little thematically messy and difficult to follow, and I don't think it is. Like, I think he managed to pull it off, but I also think that perhaps, if you come into this movie expecting a beginning, a middle, and an end, it's like, "Nah, we're just gonna ruminate on some ideas, yo." And some of them will get nicely tied off and some of them won't, and that's okay.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I did also think he ultimately succeeded. But at the same time, at the beginning, when you don't know any of the characters yet, it's really difficult to kind of pinpoint who's saying what because they all have the same accent for some reason. And you're like, who's talking? And I listened with closed captions on, so that helped. But it took me some time to start caring about the voiceovers because once I knew who was who, it made more sense.
Yeah, and I almost wonder if that is intentional.
I'm
Yeah,
sure.
just just this idea of like, yeah, these are different men, but also they are part of the largest mass mobilization in history. Like in a lot of ways they are
Yeah.
interchangeable or viewed as interchangeable.
And probably the ideas are bigger than the people saying them. It's just an interesting way of looking at a war that we see so often portrayed through the battles that we see. And I mean, sure, there's battles in this, but they're not the main thing. They're to cut the story along, but I don't think they're the point of the movie.
No, and apparently Terrence Malick didn't really vibe with shooting the battle scenes. It was his least favorite part, which is kind of hilarious in terms of, he wanted to make a war movie.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
I will say I also watched the other adaptation of The Thin Red Line, which was made like 2 years after the book was published, and it's a super different approach. I think if you watch it, it really feels in a similar vein with a lot of movies that were being made at that time. So it's definitely not an art movie like the Terrence Malick one is. It's more of a straight up adaptation. They focus on actually Welsh, the Sean Penn character, is also a main character in the first adaptation, but then the other main character is, like, barely appears in the Terrence Malick movie, like, they just chose a totally different set of character relationships to focus on,
Mm.
and so There's a lot less kind of breadth and depth and a lot less of a thematic focus, and it made me laugh. We'll talk about this a bit more later, but James Jones didn't really like your classic comic book style war movie, and I do think, unfortunately, the '64 adaptation is one of those quote unquote phony war films that he critiqued so heavily. It's just very noisy. I remember thinking like halfway through, I was like, can I just maybe I'll just turn off this cacophonous noise and watch the closed captioning for a little while. So, an extremely different movie from the Terrence Malick one, and I think it's super interesting to watch them both and just see, like, how radically of a different take 2 directors can have.
Speaking of turning off the noise, I did spend a lot of the movie with the sound on low because I was so scared of Japanese popping up and scaring me. But then later I learned it's not the kind of movie that wants to scare you. It wants you to be scared, but it's not out there to scare you.
Yeah. No, for sure.
Are we ready to get into the plot?
Yeah. I think now's the time.
Let's get into the plot.
We open on an idyllic scene in a tropical paradise. There are these tall grasses, there are these lush trees, there's animals everywhere. It's very peaceful where Melanesian people go about their lives under the palm trees on the beach. US Army Private Robert Witt, played by Jim Caviezel, is AWOL, ruminating on life and death in this peaceful environment. Throughout the film, many characters will speak in voiceover, bearing their innermost thoughts and philosophies about death, love, war, and everything that relates to being human. So we're getting a little bit of voiceover throughout this part too.
Yeah, beautiful opening scene. If you don't know anything about this movie, you might be confused to what is going on until um we get to the next scene where his escape in paradise is rudely interrupted when I think it's a scouting boat comes over to the island, and he and his friend who he's there with are captured by First Sergeant Eddie Welsh, played by Sean Penn. And Sean Penn, I mean Eddie Welsh, kind of takes mercy on him, shows mercy a little, and sends him to a disciplinary unit as a stretcher bearer instead of sending him in for a court martial. So he's like, "Oh, you're lucky. I'm just demoting you to a disciplinary unit. So you're lucky." And we begin to understand some of the philosophical differences between the characters in this film after a conversation, during which Wells expresses some cynicism and the belief that a man can only look out for himself. Well, Whit is the one who resists those conclusions. He doesn't believe that's true, so they're vastly different men. But they also, Wellston also says, "I may be the only real friend you have," which I thought was interesting. They're polar opposites, but also they belong together in a way.
Yeah, I also I don't know how lucky he is to have his gun taken away and to be sent in as effectively into heavy fire so he can be a stretcher bearer. But
Yeah.
guess it depends. This is the core relationship. These 2 men are foils for each other throughout the movie. I do think Sean Penn is really good in this. Jim Caviezel is a tough one for me because he's just the Passion of the Christ guy. He's the QAnon guy. It's hard for me to look past that, but he is very, I don't know, ethereally handsome. So there is that going for him. He has those, the big eyes, and you always get these shots of his face and his expressions.
Meanwhile, for me, that face makes me think, oh god, this guy is a serial killer. He's absolutely terrifying to me. Like, there's something about the way he looks. I can't, it's just, I'm like, there's nothing and too much going on behind his eyes at the same time.
Well, okay, so apparently Terrence Malick does this thing where he films every scene with dialogue and then he also films it without dialogue. Because his whole thing is that he's always trying to strip out dialogue, and everyone who edits his movies is like, sometimes we do need dialogue though. So how about you film both? But I do think it's really interesting to imagine sending 2 actors into a scene and being like, yeah, don't speak to each other, but still get the vibe across. So it really forces you to do some acting, I guess.
I did really like that about this movie. So much is being said with the unsaid. It's really quite a feat to be able to do that convincingly. And one of the biggest takeaways I had from all these actors is the portrayal of absolute horror and fear. I've never seen people in a war movie look this scared, ever.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. One of the things I will mention is that in terms of departures from the book, the character of Wit is very, very different. He's not this, like, everybody hold hands and kumbaya type of guy, like, I believe in God sort, like, in the book. That's really not his vibe at all. He's this racist dude from, the deep woods of Kentucky, and he got shifted out of his current company because he was a shit disturber, and then he's spending the whole time trying to get back in with his current company, but he has this really peculiar set of personal principles where he gets back in with his old company because he wants to be with his guys, and then the company commander gets relieved of duty, and then he's like, "Well, I didn't like that that happened, so I'm going back to my other company." And then he finds out that, there's been another change of CEO, so he's like, "Okay, now I'll come back to this company." And then something else happens and he's like, "Nah, I don't like it here anymore. I'm going away again." So he's just this guy who seems to do whatever he wants to in the army. He wants to be with his guys, but he's got these very serious principles in terms of who he will and won't serve under, and people sort of just seem to let him do whatever he wants.
It's interesting in this movie because in the very opening, we kind of learn that it's not the first time that he went AWOL. So it's like he is a bit of a troublemaker. Then later in the film, you don't really see that anymore. So I feel like they put it in his past a little bit more than in the movie itself, which I thought was strange because I was expecting him to be reluctant to serve a bit more.
Yeah, Bookwit is trying to get into the fight as much as possible, but he's very much on a personal level, not a hero.
No. Well, interestingly enough, I think in this movie, none of them are heroes, which is kind of the point of the movie, a little bit.
Mhm.
I've never seen an American war movie. This is American, right? Terrence Malick is American. Yeah, I'm not gonna say some dumb shit. I've never seen an American movie with less brave people doing brave shit. Like, it's not in there too much. People are doing what they have to do, but they're not going out of their way to earn any medals at all.
Yeah, and huge contrast with Saving Private Ryan, which came out the same year.
Yeah, totally different movies.
As we discussed in our Pacific episodes, the 1st Marine Division was relieved on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in December of 1942. And then Charlie Company, this fictional company who we will follow throughout this film and of which our main characters are a part, they're part of the army group that lands on Guadalcanal to take over from the Marines. And so we encounter more members of the company aboard the Navy ship that is taking them towards Guadalcanal. Each harbors his own worries and doubts. Brigadier General Quintard, played by John Travolta, who will never appear again, lights a fire under his subordinate, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Tall, played by Nick Nolte, who I did think was pretty good in this, who is a career soldier born at the wrong time, a man nearing retirement who is only now in his first war and desperate to have something to show for it.
I agree with you that Nick Nolte was good, but I also thought that his character, Joel, was such the only characterization, I think, of like a really tough army commander that we've seen in other movies. But other than that, no character that we see in this is a character we've seen in other movies specifically. But this character was almost a caricature, except he did have motivations, whereas in other films they don't get a motivation whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think the most important scene for him is the scene where he has sent this little group led by John Cusack's character up a mountain, and John Cusack has just done a bunch of hero shit in as much as anyone does hero shit in this movie, and he's gonna be nominated for a Medal of Honor and all this stuff, and then it's him talking to the Nick Nolte character, and the Nolte character being like, "Yeah, we're gonna press forward," and he's like, "Well, we don't have any water," and he's like, "That's fine, I don't care about that. The fight's not gonna wait," and he's very much like pushing his guy so that he can get glory, and you're seeing this kind of contrast between the guy who actually did the hero shit and the guy who like wants to take the credit for the hero shit.
Yeah, yeah. I did think that his voiceover on the boat with John Travolta's character. Anyway, can we talk briefly about John Travolta and how I can never take this man seriously in a war movie? He just looks too much like John Travolta. It's like he cannot get away from himself. I just couldn't see past it. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I don't know, man. I always get the sense that he's too in on the joke, like he knows he's acting, we know he's acting kind of thing.
Yeah, 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 for sure, yeah. It doesn't feel honest or something what he's doing.
Yeah.
Whereas the Nick Nolte character, his voiceover is really interesting. You almost think he's a little bit insecure in the first scene, and then later he becomes this really tough commander who I think is still insecure, except he's acting like he's not. The company lands unopposed on Guadalcanal, even though they are terrified that they will be torpedoed and stuff and mortared and all that shit. But that's the first sign that their intelligence, information, and the armor's organizational capacity is not very good. So the beach is quiet, and then the next morning, the company begins their attack on an enemy stronghold called Hill 210. And this is a fictional place, but the whole battle is based on Jones's real experiences, I take it.
Yeah, for sure, and I think Hill 210 is a stand-in for battles everywhere, you know? It's
Yeah,
like, when you're reading the book, you are getting all of the intimate details of his experience. I mean, I don't think you could write The Thin Red Line if you hadn't been there, because there's just so many little nitty-gritty specific things that he talks about, but also it's like, this battle could be anywhere, anytime, you know?
yeah,
And I think that experiences and the inner thoughts of the men stand out more clearly against it.
yeah. I did really like the portrayal of this battle on this hill. There's no clear objective because they cannot see it. They know there's machine guns up there, but they cannot see them. And this hill is like this really tall, grassy hill, and there's one ridge after the other, and they have to go up and up and up, and there's no way of knowing when they'll be reaching the end of it, which I thought was really interesting and clearly probably a bit of a commentary about what they were doing on an island like Guadalcanal in the first place. Like, it's a big rock with a bunch of grass on it. Why the fuck are we here?
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. The company commander, Captain Jim Staros, played by Elias Koteas, sees the chaos and horror taking place all around them as the Japanese forcefully defend the hill. And there are quite a few striking deaths in this part. So, the death of Sergeant Keck, played by Woody Harrelson, he accidentally grabs his grenade wrong, and then he has to roll on top of it to save the rest of his guys. And he dies by essentially getting his ass blown up. It's a bit of a silly death, it's a pointless death, but also it's so sobering, you know?
Immediately. And also, if you're wondering, is everybody in this movie? Yes, everybody is in this movie.
Everyone is. There's also the death of Lieutenant White, played by Jared Leto. He's the leader of the first squad, I believe, that gets to go on this uphill charge, and he gets killed pretty much immediately, you know, and you hear the Nick Nolte character being like, "Yeah, great leadership skills, and he did a great job leading the men," and whatever, and it's like, "Yeah, he stood up and got shot in the face," like
I miss Jared Leto as an actor. I think he's always really good as an actor, like, but he's also so striking that whenever he's in something, I'm like, "Oh, that's Jared Leto over there."
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. This was definitely a time before he took himself so seriously, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the death of Private Tella, as played by Kirk Acevedo. And this one, I mean, all of these come from the book more or less, but this scene is remarkably similar to the way it played out in the book. And so he's this young man, he's been shot a couple of times, and he's just in so much pain, and he's screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming. And at the top of the hill, everyone is sort of unsettled and unnerved by the fact that this guy just keeps screaming and he won't die. And so a couple of medics go down and try and get him. The medics get shot. And so then it falls to the Sergeant Welsh character, the Sean Penn character, to run down the hill. And this is the first time, I mean, in the book, Welsh is kind of an antagonist for our main character, Fife. They don't get along. Welsh is always kind of on his ass. And so this is the first time we see Welsh do something selfless and, dare I say, heroic, but he obviously doesn't see it that way for him. So he runs down the hill to this young man who's dying, and he gives him all of these syringes of morphine. And, you know, he doesn't want to stick him with all this morphine because he'll die, but he hands him all these syringes and then runs back up the hill. And then the young man sticks himself with like 10 morphine syringes and mercifully, blissfully passes away. And then Welsh gets back up to the top of the hill, and the company commander's like, "Yeah, you know, I'll put you in for a medal." And he's like, "I don't want your fucking medal. Like, shove it." Because in his mind, it's like, that wasn't heroic what I did. I literally went down that hill to stop that guy from screaming because he was freaking us all out.
Yeah, and Kirk as a video is really good in this small part that he has. Like, it's a very memorable scene, and it's really well acted. And it didn't make me cry, but the idea of someone just being in so much agony is just horrible.
Yeah. for sure. Kirk Acevedo, we should say, for the uninitiated, was in Band of Brothers. We think he's great.
I'm glad they didn't give him the role where he had to lie on top of his grenade and get his ass blown off, because he's done that already.
Yes. And I did make a note here in my movie notes about how good the soundtrack is because even when the Americans are winning the battle, it's still scored like a tragedy.
Damn straight.
Wit, at this point, returns to the company. He's unable to stay away. He pretty much pops up in the middle of all the chaos and he's like, "Hey, you need help? You want me to do anything?" And yeah, so he gets taken on again.
Welcome back, Wit. Staros refuses an order by Colonel Saul, our big commander, because he wants the company to make a full force frontal assault on the hill. But Staros fears it's kind of a suicide mission, and he's not wrong. So they're on the radio. They're just yapping back and forth, and that's when Colonel Saul comes down the line to see the situation for himself because he's not used to being contradicted, and two, this is a pretty daring thing I think for Staros to do because he's disobeying a direct order. So he goes down there, and then unluckily for Staros, the Japanese have pulled back after the forward action by Kak's platoon. So Tom perceives him to be a weak man. I love Staros. Staros in this is great. I love a leader who's unsure of things.
Yeah, definitely. I did think it was interesting. We talked about this a little offline, but in the book, Staros is Stein, and there's a brief reference to him being Jewish. And a lot of the uncertainty that some of the men have about trusting his judgment, etc., is anti-Semitic. And so, in both film adaptations, they made him not Jewish, so they took that element out, and I'm not really sure why.
I wonder, for this movie in particular, I could imagine it being done because the conflict is the war itself and they didn't want to add maybe another conflict to the same story. Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that, but I could see that as a reason to do it, but at the same time, why?
Yeah. It just seems odd because, the Jones book is a commentary on so much of what he personally witnessed when he was in the
Yeah.
army. And
Hmm.
especially for, himself not being a Jewish man to perceive that this hidden layer of discrimination was happening to his Jewish colleagues. I mean, this is not something that you would necessarily spot in every mid century novel, right?
No, no, for sure. And they also took out a little bit of gayness, apparently, from this. That isn't a novel.
Yeah, they sure did. So, when I watched the first film adaptation in the '60s, I was like, "They're not gonna make this gay," and I was right. And then when I watched the Malick version, I was like, "I wonder if they're gonna make this a little gay," but they didn't, which I thought was an interesting choice. James Jones, the author, was open about having some same-sex experiences himself. I don't think he was gay because he did have well-known affairs with women, so bisexual perhaps. But anyway, there's definitely a couple parts in the book that are quite it's quite obviously gay. They're not like this is not an illusion or anything. It's like, no, they're it's a little gay in some parts. And yeah, they just they cut that whole cloth. It didn't make it into either adaptation.
Yeah, which is again interesting. It also makes me think they just wanted to focus on the one big picture war's evil, war poisons the beauty of nature kind of thing. But, who knows? I'm not in either one of these men's heads and I haven't read anything about it online. So, who knows? We'll never know, I guess.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, I think, because we lose a little bit of the American GI is not necessarily a unflawed hero, and that they're all quite different elements of this army, imperfect in their own ways, and they all have their own. Especially at the time, being a gay or bisexual man in the army would have been quite isolating, and I think that would play quite well with some of the central themes. But nevertheless,
Yeah.
it was 1998, so there's also that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it would have humanized the film a little, even both the Jewishness, the anti-Semitic commentary, and the gayness. It would have given these characters a little more than just philosophical things to deal with, and also just very practical and human things that aren't necessarily as philosophically complicated, but would have affected their time in the army. But, you can't have it all like that.
Yeah. Private Jack Bell, played by Ben Chaplin, who barely thinks of anything aside from his wife, the only woman we see in this movie in his imagination. Her name is Marty. She's played by Miranda Otto. He returns from the hill with recon suggesting that a flanking maneuver could help to reduce the bunker and successfully take the hill. So Tall sends a small group of men, led by Captain Gaff, played by John Cusack, to capture the bunker.
It confused me that Thor was like, "You only need 6 men. This is gonna be enough to take out all these machine guns that we know are out there." Like, why only 6? Like, what's the point?
I think a group of 6 men can be much sneakier than a bigger group.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair, but at the same time, they've been doing small platoons the entire time and they've all just been killed. I mean, they are ultimately successful, so I guess maybe it's not a terrible idea after all, but it felt to me like, does he care about these men's lives? And then later there's a conversation where it's very clear that he doesn't care about the individual men's lives. So I guess that answers my question. But yeah, this whole battle is so long. It takes about an hour. It's amazing.
Yeah, interesting too because this battle is the main conflict of the movie, I guess. In the book is like 500 some odd pages long, and so this is just one battle, and then there's more battles that happen after that, but the movie kind of
Mm,
focuses on this one.
right. I think it's pretty amazing that they managed to make it interesting for an hour because it's the same terrain, it's the same goal, and yet it's interesting the entire time. But
Mhm.
yeah, after a fierce battle, they are successful, this group of 6 men. And the men react differently, with some obviously numb and indifferent to the carnage around them. Private First Class Doll, played by Dash Hawk, notes with unexpected excitement that he's killed a man now, but there's nothing anyone can do to him about it. And you've mentioned this already, but though some of the men are out of water, Joel insists on pressing forward because they've got the momentum now. And the men are excited that they've just won a battle, but they're also just dying of thirst. So, great idea.
Yeah, they're at the stage where men are just passing out face first on the ground with heat stroke, so
Yeah.
not ideal.
I do like the constant conversation between Joel and Staros about this, almost trying to reason with this man who clearly cannot be reasoned with because all he wants to do is more fighting. And he says about 4 or 5 times, "We'll take the hill by midnight." And I don't know how many days this is, but I think it's over multiple days. So it's
Yeah.
like, it made me laugh. It's a funny way to portray this man who has one objective and who will do anything in his power to get it.
The reason why I mentioned PFC Doll in my notes, even though he doesn't appear very much, is because he's one of the main characters in the 1964 adaptation. It's him in Welsh. So I just
Mm,
thought it was so interesting that in this movie he doesn't get a lot of lead airtime, I guess, but he is also one of the ones who has a little gay moment in the book. When at last they are given respite, Staros is relieved of his command because Tall thinks he's just a big wuss. And Staros is like, "Well, I don't regret what I did because I was trying to save the lives of my men." And Tall was like, "Oh, you think we're going to win this war by not having any of your men die? You think it's okay if one man dies? How about 2 men?" Anyways, he's being a dick about it. But yeah, Bell, meanwhile, receives a Dear John letter from his wife, and Whit discovers that his tropical paradise away with the Melanesian natives is not the way that he remembers. So all of the men drink and fight, and in voiceover, someone says, "War does not ennoble men, it turns them into dogs, it poisons the soul."
it's a great quote. I really enjoyed that quote. It's very anti war.
This is a quote from the book to give you an idea of Jones's writing style, and this is or immediately after a battle. "It was interesting to watch the gradual diminution of the universal numbness which afflicted everyone. In most of them, the numbness required about 2 days to go away. By the third day, nearly all of them had become almost the same personalities they had been before, but John Bell, for one, who watched this denummification process with more self interest than most, could not help wondering if any of them could ever really become the same again. He didn't think so, not without lying anyway. Perhaps long years after the war was done, when each had built his defenses of lies which fitted his needs, and had listened long enough to those other lies the national propaganda would have distilled for them by then, they could all go down to the American Legion, like their fathers, and talk about it within the limits of a prescribed rationale, which allowed them self respect. They could pretend to each other they were men and avoid admitting that they had once seen something animal within themselves that terrified them. But then, most of them were doing that right now, already.
That's pretty cool. I think you sent me this also while you were reading it. I like how self aware it is too. As a writer, I'm sure he felt like that. So that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, there's a lot of honesty and real articulation of what without feeling the need to gloss over and make himself or others look better than they were, I think, in this book.
Yeah, interesting. I don't think I will read it just for the fact that you didn't like the first half, and it's a lot of pages for me, so I don't think I will read it, but I'm glad you read me some of it. There's a scene in the movie where we see the Americans overrunning a Japanese encampment, and we see the Japanese as victims in this scene in a way that I don't think I've seen the Japanese portrayed in any other movie. They are crying, they are begging for their lives. Many of them are wounded, so I'm sure it's also in part a medical tent. We see someone cutting the gold out of their teeth, not unlike in the Pacific, but it's just kicked up a notch in this movie, and I thought it was really interesting to see that where the Japanese are always the aggressors, they also get a moment where they are the victims in the story.
I like this piece of the book because their encampment being overrun is just kind of pitiful. Like, they're clearly not prepared for it. They're just being absolutely massacred by the Americans. And then, as soon as it's over, the Americans are covering themselves in glory. And you can tell that they're going to go home and be like, yeah, I was in this fight and I did this and I did that and bragging about it. And there's just nothing bragworthy about, shooting an unarmed man.
No, I don't think we see it very often in American movie making, except for maybe the Pacific, where we get to see that the Americans, no matter how horrible the Japanese are, and we know they are horrible, and especially to the natives who live there and in other places they've taken, the Americans can also be capital B bad to people. And I think it's good that we get to see it, and I appreciated the scene for that, for sure.
Yeah, it's really important in terms of Jones's whole anti-war thesis, I think. The fact that soldiers in this orgy of bloodletting often behave badly because of the context that they're in.
Yeah, and we see them, I think later, the soldier that takes out the gold from the teeth, we see him later struggling with the fact that he's done that, which I think is also good because people go through shit and it gives you kind of a three-dimensional view of what an American soldier can be. And in the experience, First Lieutenant George Bann, played by Paul Gleason, replaces Starros. He doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. As the company waits like sitting ducks during a maneuver one day, he sends out a scouting group consisting of Wit and two young soldiers, including a very wide-eyed Corporal Five, played by Adrian Brody, and an equally baby-faced Private Coombs, played by Matt Doran, to discover where the Japanese are, despite the protest of more experienced men. So they're in the jungle, it's wet, they're in the river. I think they're being shelled at this point by the Japanese, but they don't know exactly where it's coming from. So it's a pretty scary situation. I was kind of tired at this point. This movie is long. And I wanted them to be okay? So I was like, oh no, this is gonna end badly. You just know it.
The movie kind of conflated the Tall and Band characters because in the book, Band is the one who's like, let's keep going. And he's getting further and further and further ahead from the other companies in the battalion that he's like supposed to be keeping pace with because he's just a glory hound. He wants all the glory for himself. And so they reach this place where it's basically them, their company, they're isolated. And he's like, yeah, we're going to guard this road. And Wit is like, I don't think that's a good idea. And he's like, Band is like, yeah, yeah, yeah. We'll just send a couple guys down there. It'll be fine. And Wit is like, what if a whole bunch of Japanese come up the road? We're all going to get massacred. And he's like, just do what I tell you to do. So Wit volunteers to go down, even though he thinks it's a bad idea. And their whole group of guys gets massacred except him and I think one other guy. That's ultimately why Band ends up getting replaced and relieved of his command because, they're like, yeah, you can't just show up places and decide that you're going to win a medal and decide that all of your guys are expendable in the service of doing that.
In a way, Band reminded me of Norman Dyke in Band of Brothers. Like, he's the unpopular replacement commander who doesn't know, who's not very good at his job perhaps, or is just not very good at commanding this specific group of people. Obviously, we get to see that Sterles was like beloved by his men and they all support him in his decisions, and I'm really pleased that he tried to stop them from doing the frontal assault on the hill that they think they are just going to die in, which wasn't a weird thought because they were all dying. So this guy's obviously there to replace someone beloved, and he's not very good at it. So it reminded me of Norman Dyke and Ben.
Yeah, for sure. I think in the book too, like he's comes from within the company. And so everyone already kind of thinks this guy's a dick. And then because he's such a glory hound, I really think the part where he gets all of his own guys massacred is like a better comeuppance for that kind of character than the way they presented him in the movie. But I mean, it could be just personal preference on my part.
I feel like he only has about one line in this movie anyway. Like, you only see him once, and that's when he tells everybody that they have to go look for the Japanese.
Yeah. Adrian Brody has absolutely massive eyes in this. He's probably just surprised that he was told he was gonna be the main character and that he got most of his lines cut.
Well, he's lucky he's even still in the movie because there's about three well-known actors that shot scenes that didn't make it into the movie at all. So,
Yeah.
you know how it goes.
Yeah, the Adrian Brody character, Corporal Fife, that's James Jones's self-insert character. That's the character that's based on him, and so he's a very principal member of the ensemble in the book.
And he's really not in this movie. Like, he's a side character for sure. He's tiny and inexperienced, and he looks scared a lot of the time, which helps if you have got huge eyes.
What I do think is interesting is they sidelined him a bit in the 1964 one too. Like he's in it more than Adrian Brody is in this movie, but not much more. And I think that's an interesting choice to make because Corporal Fife as James Jones's insert character is very honest about he is scared all the time. All he wants to do is lay face down on the ground. He does not want to be involved in any of this. It's just so refreshing and brilliant to read someone from that generation being like, yeah, I was scared shitless all the time. I was not a hero. I didn't do hero shit. And then towards the end of the book, when he starts to get more hardened and better at being a soldier, he notices this like extreme change within him and how he's like becoming a different person. And it's very interesting. So I just thought it was interesting in the movies. I'm like, oh, you didn't want this guy who is, I don't know, sort of a wuss as your main character, I guess. Not interesting enough.
Yeah, that's for sure a funny choice again. Again, one I think we'll never know why they did it. Which I looked for interviews with Terrence Malick, but there aren't that many. Like, it's mostly other people talking about Terrence Malick.
Yeah. Yeah, he's pretty reclusive, I think. When Coombs is badly wounded on their little three-man patrol, Wit sends Fife ahead to warn the company that a Japanese attack is imminent while he draws the enemy away. Ultimately, he is surrounded by Japanese soldiers, and there had been this scene earlier in the movie, which again I gather was not in the script, but Terrence Malick decided to put it in after, where Wit is thinking about his mother and the way that she died and saying that he hopes he can meet death as peacefully as she did. And so we see him peacefully meet death. He raises his weapon so that they'll shoot him effectively, and then he dies.
They take a lot of time to let him die. Like, it's a scene, it's maybe 3 minutes long, where it's just the Japanese kind of surrounding him. It's an entire battalion or a platoon, like a big group of Japanese soldiers. And at first he's running away from them, and then they just catch up to him in a clearing in the jungle that's beautiful. And they just yap at him in Japanese for a bit, and then they shoot him. And Coombs actually is a young boy. Wit tells him to wait until they're shooting and then just fling himself down the river to get away. And we don't actually know what happens to him. I think he probably dies, but we don't see it happen.
Well, none of this happens in the book, and book Wit survives. So if anyone's really pulling for Wit, you'll have to check out the novel.
It's me! I'm pulling for Wit. I was just pretending the whole time that in the next scene where we see Sergeant Wells bury Wit, that it was the Coombs character that was dead and not Wit, and I could live happily ever after with that thought. That Wit is just somewhere out there in his jungle with his native people that he enjoys.
Can't be. The
But
guy who has all the faith in humankind is the one who has to die.
yeah, and also at his grave, Welsh has a word about, I think it's sparkle or something that Wit had said to him before about the human sparkle or the human light or whatever. And he says, "How's your sparkle now?" in a very cynical way. And yeah, it's not a good ending for Wit. I don't like it. But Wells gets to observe the new company CEO, Captain Bush, and in case you needed another cameo, it's George Clooney with very long eyelashes. And he's trying to get a handle on the combat bloody men that are now under his command. And soon what remains of the company is shipped off of Guadalcanal and toward their next battle. And I do like the way this ends because it's beautiful. It's just good cinematography. It's like the island is left alone again, the war is gone, and we get to see the island's beauty some more.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the whole thing, man. Good thing so many men fought and died for this chunk of earth that they will all leave and never return to.
Isn't that so weird? How can you go back to your life afterward and think that was really useful what I did on that island there?
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say too, it was interesting to me when I pulled up this movie on whatever streaming service I watched it on. They described it as a blood brotherhood, and I was like, that is not what this movie or the book are about. It's all about how war is extremely isolating and every man has to confront himself and the kind of person that he becomes and is he's going to feel this profound disconnect with his fellow man because of how much he's going to change and how much he's going to have to, learn about the kind of man that he is. And so, like, yeah, I think that the way this ends with these guys just going off and it's like, yeah, you've been changed forever for what? Like, I think it's a really solid anti-war movie ending.
Yeah, I really thought it was a good ending. I mean, I wish he hadn't killed Whip, but other than that, um, I don't know why he necessarily had to die. Like, the impact of the movie would have been just as strong if he lived.
No, I
But
don't
I get
agree. I think he has to die because he's the one who has all the faith in humanity, and he's the one who's just like, "Yeah, I do believe in a higher power. I do think that what we're doing here matters." He has to die.
interesting. You think it's an improvement on the book?
Well, the book is not like I said, book wit is so different from movie wit that this main character relationship that Malick focuses on is not really a thing in the book. And so the way the book ends is just like it has similar themes, but it ends a lot differently.
Okay, so maybe not an improvement on the book, but at least in terms of the movie's themes and messaging, it makes sense for the character with the most faith in humanity to die because that's what war does to a man, so he also has to die kind of in that way.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
yeah, okay, yeah, I'll take it. And to be fair, I did call him out to be kind of serial killer looking in the beginning, so why am I even so mad about it?
Jones, as we mentioned briefly at the beginning, cried phony war films. He wrote a newspaper column about this in 1963. Here's a quote from that. He was talking about some recent war movies that he had watched, and he said, "When I finished, I was not only almost cross eyed from watching film, near death from explosive sound effects, I was more depressed with the essential adolescence of America, maybe I should say of the race, than I have perhaps ever been. If our war films are an indication of our social maturity in an age when we have the capacity of destroying ourselves, there's little hope for us. Now, why this? Why, after so much soul searching by Americans, so many advances in so many other fields during the last 20 years, have war films remained at the same essentially adolescent level as the war films of 1943?" So I guess the question is, do we think Malick's film succeeded in not just giving the audiences what they want, aka heroes?
Yes, he does. I mean, for me, it's clearly an anti-war film. Nobody's doing anything specifically heroic except for maybe the John Cusack character and maybe Welsh when going to see this boy who's about to die. But even he doesn't think it's heroic. So I do think it's a more philosophical as well than any other war movie I've ever seen ever. I mean, the Pacific tries to do a little bit of that, a little bit of soul searching, but this one definitely does a better job even. So I think it succeeds. How about you?
Yeah, I certainly think Jones would have liked this one a lot better than the first adaptation that came out in 1964, which was much more cleanly a war movie in the tradition of war movies that were being made at that time. And I totally see what he means. I mean, we watched a lot of war movies now from, the 1940s through today. And these movies that have the vibe of like The Great Escape and that kind of stuff. Yeah, I don't think that would have been his vibe. He's not a fan of like the rah rah America and that kind of stuff. I don't think he would have really gone for like, the the Band of Brothers type stuff either. But I'm super interested because he wrote, and he's most famous for this trilogy of World War II books, of which The Thin Red Line is the middle one. And then the first one is From Here to Eternity, which is based on the fact that he was stationed on Hawaii, so he witnessed the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And I'm reading that one right now, and they did make a movie adaptation, so I'm super curious to see what that's like. And then he has a third book that is about his time recovering in the hospital from an ankle surgery that he had because he had re-injured it when he was on Guadalcanal. I'm curious to see what the Here to Eternity adaptation is like, and I wonder if this is just a problem with adapting war movies, if it's just really difficult to make a movie about war without glorifying it in some way.
I think it is really difficult, especially in American war movies. It's difficult because of how Hollywood likes itself a lot. And another kind of parting thought, I guess, about the movie I'm having as you're discussing this is that it's the first time I've seen a movie depict the Americans as the evil that comes to Guadalcanal. And obviously the Japanese are much better, but they are coming into this like untouched paradise. They are destroying it. And when reading about the movie, apparently whenever a soldier died, Malik had wanted to show a tree exploding or a bird flying away injured. So he had wanted to be even less literal originally, which I think is such an interesting, like, I'm not really all that into nature, so I don't know if the nature part by itself would affect me that much, but just the ability to be so self-critical as an American is rare, and I think it's really interesting to put that in a war movie.
Yeah, I do think, like, in as much as some of the philosophizing in this can come across as a little pretentious, I would like it if more war movies took a big swing like this.
Yeah, me too. I'm really glad we watched this, and I'm surprised almost that it took us so long to get to this one because it's a fairly well known one. And yet,
Yeah.
we've not watched it for 2 years. But at least now we have something good in our officially our third year of making podcasts because this is episode 105, which is pretty amazing.
Woohoo.
Good opener. Anyway, we do need to rate this movie, but before we do, I'd like to remind you that you can share this episode with a friend. Every time you share this episode with a friend, you get to save a little bit of Guadalcanal from the evil Americans coming to us.
How many 2-second cameos out of 10 would you rate this movie?
I would rate this movie probably 9 2-second cameos out of 10. I just thought it was fantastic and it was different and it was daring and it was unwarlike for a war movie and the acting was good and the soundtrack was amazing and it looked beautiful and I'd watch it again actually. How about you?
Yeah, I thought it was really good. I had watched the earlier adaptation first, and I was like, "Oh, not bad, classic war movie." And then I saw this one, and then I don't know if it was a contrast, but it really blew me away. I think it helped me understand the book a little better too. It was nice to see this whole thing where it's like, yeah, these guys are this is kind of the anti-Band of Brothers, Each guy is very much facing the war and himself alone. And yeah, it makes for really interesting watching. It's such an interesting exploration of these themes that we've seen different directors and different writers handle in such different ways. And as we've said, the cinematography is beautiful. There's some really good acting in it. I definitely would recommend it. I think it's a solid watch. So I'm going to rate this. I'm going to give it 8 2-second cameos out of 10.
Okay, I think it should be higher. Can I pressure you into doing it higher?
Oh God. I could do 8.5. 8.5 2-second cameos out of 10.
I'll take that. That's allowed.
I will say I've never given anything a 10. So 8 is pretty high because the highest rating I've ever given is like a 9 or a 9.5.
It's 8.5. That's all you're getting. I mean, You're not allowed to go any lower. Anyway, are you reading anything?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I am reading From Here to Eternity by James Jones, but I also have started Empire of the Sun by J.G. Ballard, and I'm actually really enjoying that one. It's not what I was expecting.
That's always interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. How about you?
I finished a book that I was reading for 6 weeks.
Yay!
Finished! I'm reading a new book for a book club, which is Dutch, and it's only 180 pages, and it's like the margins of the book are really like white margins, so I feel like I should be finished next week.
Nice.
And other than that, I'm not reading anything yet, but I will be getting a historical novel from a stranger on Threads who commented on my post and was like, I like your camera. And then I saw that he wrote a series of like spy novels, and I was like, can I read some of your books? So he's sending some of those over. So I will be reading those.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah. So maybe if they're any good, I'll send them to you. And then if you like them, we can have him on the podcast.
Sounds great.
Thank you again for listening to another episode of Rosie. You can follow us wherever you get your podcasts and rate us 5 stars. You can send this episode to a friend. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. You can buy our merchandise. You can find our website at rosieTheReviewer.com if you want more information about a lot of things. And we'll see you next week.
Bye.